Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the weeds on legal professional responsibility. It's fascinating stuff. We're looking at what happens when very public legal figures find themselves under the microscope for their conduct, especially when politics gets tangled up in it all. Our main source for this is an analysis from the YouTube channel Midas Touch. They focused on disciplinary actions against two attorneys you might know, Ken Chesboro and Alina Haba. So our mission today is really to unpack the specific things they're accused of doing, get a handle on the rules attorneys are supposed to follow, and explore, the consequences. It's basically a look at how the legal profession polices itself and what happens when that system gets tested. So, ready to jump in.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting, I think, isn't just these two specific stories, but what they tell us about the bigger picture. The core principles lawyers are meant to live by as officers of the court and how those principles get enforced or sometimes challenged depending on where you are.
Okay, let's start with Ken Chesboro. His name popped up a lot after the 2020 election. Can you just refresh our memory on his role back then and how that leads us to where he is now?
Sure. Ken Chesboro, he was identified as, well, one of the key architects behind the attempt to overturn the 2020 election. He worked alongside people like Peter Navarro, Sidney Powell, Jenna Ellis. His specific contribution was devising what he actually called the alternate elector scheme. The basic idea was this. Get people who weren't the real electors to gather secretly in 7 key states. They'd sign fake certificates saying they were the electors. These phony documents were then supposed to go via Mike Roman Trump's Election Day guide to Mike Pence. Pence was presiding over the Senate certification. The plan was that Pence would either recognize these fake ones, reject the real ones, or just say, hey, I can't tell, and punt the whole decision to the House. And in that scenario, the thinking was Donald Trump gets chosen as president.
Wow. Okay, that's quite a plan, a very elaborate scheme. And obviously this didn't just, go unnoticed. This led to legal problems for him, right?
Oh, definitely. Big legal problems. His actions led directly to indictments. He faced charges in Wisconsin and Georgia. And in Georgia, he ended up pleading guilty to crimes related to trying to steal the election. Now, that conviction itself kicks in a really important professional duty for lawyers. You have to tell the places where you're licensed, the bars, about convictions like that.
Right, the self-reporting requirement. And that's where things get really interesting, especially with the disbarment process. Can you walk us through how that typically works and specifically what happened with his New York law license?
Certainly. So practicing law isn't national, right? You have to be admitted state by state. You pass a bar exam, usually has a multi-state part and a state part. Then each state has its own body that regulates attorneys. Sometimes it's called the bar, like the Florida bar. In other places like New York, it's actually the court system itself that handles attorney regulation. So in New York, they found that Ken Chesboro didn't properly report his Georgia conviction. That alone is a serious breach. But they didn't stop there. The New York authorities went deeper. They looked closely at his testimony, his whole role in what they basically called trying to overthrow the will of the people. They found he broke a whole bunch of rules for attorney conduct in New York. And these rules, they're pretty much standard across almost every state. The end result. A 3-judge panel, an appellate panel in New York's 3rd Department decided to disbar him, flat out.
Disbarred.
Right.
So he cannot practice law in New York.
Correct. Now, technically, he could try to appeal to the highest court there, the Court of Appeals. But the Midas Touch analysis suggests he's pretty much, well, done and cooked as far as practicing in New York goes.
So what does that mean for him practicing anywhere else? Is he still licensed?
Well, he's been disbarred in other places, too. But interestingly, the one place he does still hold a law license is Texas. And the source, Midas Touch, points out that Sidney Powell is also still a member of the Texas bar. The implication, or maybe the direct statement, is that Texas, well, they don't disbar anybody.
That definitely raises a question about consistency, doesn't it? How accountable lawyers are state by state.
It absolutely does. A major question about uniform standards.
Okay, let's pivot now from Chesboro's past actions to someone facing scrutiny for their current role. Alina Haba. She's the acting interim U.S. attorney for all of New Jersey right now, a federal prosecutor role. But she's also facing some serious professional questions. What's the heart of the grievance against her?
Right, Alina Haba. Her conduct as U.S. attorney has brought a lot of criticism. The core allegation is that she's violating the Department of Justice's own manual and basic standards of prosecutorial conduct. A really big concern highlighted by Midas Touch is her use of the media, making what are called extrajudicial statements.
Extrajudicial. So comments outside of actual court proceedings.
Exactly. Comments made to the press, on social media, things like that. And the rules generally forbid statements that are likely to bias a judge or a jury or even just the public against someone who's supposed to be presumed innocent. The Midas touch analysis is quite critical, calling her a political hack and noting she doesn't have prior experience as, say, a federal prosecutor or a clerk in federal court.
Okay, are there specific examples given of actions that drew this kind of criticism?
Yes, several were mentioned. For example, under her leadership, the mayor of Newark, Ross Baraka, was arrested, indicted for trespassing. But that indictment later got dismissed. And apparently, a federal magistrate judge actually called Haba out personally in court, told her office they must do better, must be held to a higher standard.
Wow, okay. Any others?
Yeah, there was also the indictment of Congresswoman LaMonica McIver, also from New Jersey. She pleaded not guilty. The arrest was reportedly for just standing while she was observing a federal immigration detention center. And this detention center apparently is run by a Donald Trump donor, so optics weren't great there. But maybe the most significant thing is her public announcements about investigations into top New Jersey Democrats, Governor Phil Murphy, Attorney General Matt Platkin. She publicly announced criminal probes into them, alleging they weren't enforcing immigration laws, making New Jersey a sanctuary state. She even went on Fox News and X, formerly Twitter, saying she wanted it to be a warning for everybody and that she'd instructed her office to open an investigation. Plus, she's openly said she wants to turn New Jersey red, which, is generally seen as a blue state. Oh, and Mayor Baraka. He's now personally suing her for defamation.
So quite a list of controversial actions. And this has now led to a formal complaint being filed. Tell us about that.
Yes, exactly. An organization called the Campaign for Accountability filed a pretty detailed, multi-page complaint. It went to the Office of Attorney Ethics in Trenton, New Jersey. That's the body that regulates lawyers licensed in New Jersey. And the complaint alleges Haba may have broken, I think, at least 6 or 7 specific rules of professional conduct.
Okay, what kinds of rules are we talking about?
Well, they cover a range of things. There's Rule 8.4c about conduct involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation. Pretty basic integrity stuff. Then Rule 8.4d, conduct that's prejudicial to the administration of justice, basically actions that undermine the legal system itself. Also, Rule 3.4g, which prohibits threatening criminal charges just to get an edge in a civil case. And then rules specifically about those extrajudicial statements we talked about. Rule 3.6, statements likely to prejudice a proceeding, and a couple specifically for prosecutors. Rule 3.8a, which says you can't knowingly prosecute a charge if there isn't probable cause. And Rule 3.8, which again hits on extrajudicial comments, specifically ones meant to increase public condemnation of the accused.
That's quite a list of alleged violations.
It is. And the Campaign for Accountability is asking for a full investigation and, whatever discipline is appropriate if the violations are found.
This brings up a really interesting point about jurisdiction, though. How do state bar associations usually handle complaints against federal officers, like a U.S. attorney? Sounds like there's some debate there.
Yeah, this is where it gets kind of tricky, and the source highlighted this. You might think, okay, a complaint is filed, the bar opens a file, investigates, regardless of the merit, maybe. But there's this precedent involving Pam Bondi in Florida. The Florida bar apparently refused to even open an investigation against her. Their reasoning was they had no jurisdiction because she was working in the federal government at the time.
But what's the counter-argument to that?
The counter-argument is pretty straightforward, really. Look, you don't technically have to be a lawyer to be a judge or a U.S. attorney. It's probably not wise, but maybe not strictly required. But if you are a lawyer and you hold an active law license in that state, then your conduct is regulated by that state's bar, period. You're acting as an officer of the court. You stand in the well of the courtroom, inside that little gate. You're trading on your law license. So the argument goes, if you don't want to be regulated by the bar, fine, give up your license. But as long as you hold it, you're subject to the rules.
That makes sense. You're using the credential, you follow the rules tied to it.
Exactly. So the hope or the expectation expressed in the analysis is that New Jersey should, do the right thing, that they should follow New York's example with Chesboro rather than Florida's stance on Bondi. And this really ties everything together, this question of how the legal profession polices itself, especially when legal roles get mixed up with political goals.
Right. So if we zoom out now and connect these dots, what do these two cases, Chesboro's disbarment and the scrutiny on Haba, tell us about the bigger picture, about professional responsibility for lawyers right now, especially those in these really politically charged positions?
I think what's really fascinating, maybe even a bit concerning, is how they highlight the importance of these bar associations and the rules of conduct. They're supposed to maintain the integrity of the whole system. I mean, the legal profession is mostly self-policing. These rules are designed to make sure lawyers act honestly, openly, fairly. But both the Chesboro case, especially the Texas angle, and the Haba situation, they really put a spotlight on the tension between political activity or ambition and the ethical duties of being a lawyer. It raises these really crucial questions about public trust. How can people trust the legal system if the lawyers within it, the officers of the court, seem to be acting based on politics or just ignoring the rules?
Absolutely. And for you listening, why should you care about these particular legal fights? They might seem a bit inside baseball.
Well, I think understanding these cases gives you a really valuable window into the ethical rules that are supposed to govern people with a lot of power in our legal system. It shows you how that system is meant to protect all of us, really, from abuses of power or political influence getting in the way of justice. And it shows what can happen, what the stakes are when those rules get challenged or maybe aren't enforced consistently. It's fundamental to ensuring justice stays impartial, accessible, no matter what your politics are.
So today we've taken a deep dive into some serious consequences. Ken Chesboro facing disbarment, Alina Haba under significant scrutiny, all seen through this lens of professional legal conduct. It's a pretty stark reminder, isn't it? That even when the stakes are incredibly high in these intense political arenas, attorneys are still supposed to be bound by a code of ethics.
Indeed. And the details here, they really underscore this ongoing challenge. How do we keep the justice system impartial and maintain its integrity when things get so polarized?
So as you think about this deep dive, here's something to maybe chew on. In a legal system that relies on impartiality, what does it mean if the standards for holding lawyers accountable seem to differ so much depending on which state they're in, especially for those lawyers playing on the national political stage? How do we prevent a kind of two-tiered system of accountability? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and stay well informed.